All right. Okay, thank you again and welcome again to everybody this evening, afternoon, morning, whatever it is for you. My name is Hala Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am excited to introduce you to today's event, where we will be celebrating writing in three forms. We have poetry, we have a novel, and a short story collection. Each author in today's event explores themes of heritage and family and place. So I'm really excited to introduce to you Rhonda Slota reading from By Fire, which was released December 1st, 2021. Rita Bozi reading from When I Was Better, which was released June 19th, 2022. And Joanne Kiser reading from The Guitar Player and Other Stories of Exile, which was released September 13th, 2022. All three authors' books can be purchased from online retailers and from select bookstores. And of course, the books can be ordered on Atmosphere Press's website at atmospherepress.com/books. And in a moment here, I'll add a few links that you can check out to see the books on the websites. At the end of this event, we will have time for your questions. So throughout the readings, if you ever have a question for our authors, you can type it in the chat and I'll make sure it gets asked. And then during the actual reading, please just be sure to keep yourselves muted to keep extraneous sound at a minimum. Of course, you can always use the chat for any praise and comments that you'd like to share. And one last note, we at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. So if you have a manuscript of your own, we would love to read it. You can feel free to submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com. Again, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Rhonda, Rita, and Joanne today. And let's start off with our first reader, who will be Rhonda Slota. Rhonda grew up in rural Bloomington, Indiana, where studying at the big university in town wasn't even a dream for those in her family. With the help of mentors and scholarships, she was able to attend Indiana University and completed her BA in English. In 1982, she moved to Northern California, where she began writing By Fire. Many of the poems were previously published. She was twice awarded the Jessamine West Creative Writing Poetry Award, as well as the American Poetry Association's Grand Prize. She completed her MA at San Francisco State University and served as teacher and administrator in public education for 30+ years. Now she lives in Vallejo, California with her adult son, who, like her father, suffers from schizophrenic bipolar disorder. She teaches yoga and meditation and consults as a certified Ayurvedic practitioner, Ayurvedic yoga therapist, Kali Ki Reiki master, and teacher. Set in rural southern Indiana in the 1950s to 1970s, the poems in By Fire tell the story of a complex family dynamic. This debut poetry collection blends Bible images, authentic dialogue, and powerful natural forces to relay the effects of family trauma and mental illness. Rhonda has given readings locally, and her book appears in several bookstores. Literary Titan awarded By Fire the Gold Book Award and called it beautifully written and emotionally resonant. Kirkus Reviews says, each piece in this collection is like a stained glass scene, seen through the eyes of a mature poet, a poetic, moving, and nuanced portrait. Says Independent Book Review, a hauntingly beautiful collection. By Fire does justice to the life of those with mental illnesses and the effects it has on loved ones. And with that, let's welcome Rhonda.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you, Hala. I want to thank Atmosphere Press for hosting this event, and the two wonderful writers that I'm reading with today. I think it's going to be a really wonderful day for all of us. I'm really pleased that we could be here and do this together. I want to thank all of you just for taking the time out of your day to spend it with us. So I think that the introduction said all that I need to say about the poems, about the book. So I will just go ahead and read. I'm going to read about 9 poems. The first poem is The Bottomlands Are Flooded. Last night, rain beat the fields as if to pound life from the ground. Today, new plants poke their heads through a shining sheet of water. My mother in rubber boots hangs clothes on the line. She smooths each shirt with her hands as if it holds someone she loves. A fresh wind stirs the birches, wrinkles a field of water. Mother frowns. She hates the wind. Look, she says, it unsettles the trees. How lonely the world is. The Healer. My father stands behind the pulpit, lifting the Bible, a black beacon, high above his head. He sees God gleam in the grain of the beams. His prayer for the girl whose kidneys will fail her tears through his body. Power surges through his hands. He holds her bowed head. That night he kneels at the altar. I go to him, place my palm on his shoulder. He turns to me, blood-rimmed eyes. I remember my collie who leaped into the road, then turned and saw the car. I rushed to help. She snapped her teeth, then lay still. He pushes my hand away, leaves the church. Now he says his solitude saves him. His fingernails stained from factory work where he paints the gashes in television cabinets. He tells me the light hurts his eyes. In dark glasses, he watches his set, War Death in Lebanon. He whispers, this is all prophesied, the plan shaping itself around Persia. His hands fold in his lap. I'm afraid to touch him. Revelation. The child wakes up to hymns sung by her father. His hands clap, jubilant, echo from the hall. She tiptoes to her bedroom door, opens it enough to see him standing in dim light, praising God for the gift of prophecy, while the mother holds on to the wall. The child is not afraid. She remembers rituals unannounced. He rampages, purging the house. From every room, he snatches the false things, flings open the front door and throws out red plastic flowers, a can of hairspray, a fashion magazine. Entering the yard, he rips the dental plate from his own mouth. The mother cringes, hurries after him, gathering photographs, the radio, his teeth. She trudges back to the house, closes the door. Suddenly alone, he stops, lowers his head, cries. The child watches from the window. Ambulance doors lock behind him. The mother tells her sister it's like sending him to prison, but she must do it. He frightens her. She is tired. The child who has been sent to her room crouches behind the couch, wants to touch her mother's arm, still hears her father's song. He returns. The child searches his face as he speaks, glances toward the door. He tells her he has witnessed truth, wants to share the sight of vision born of flame. But sanity means following the rules. He has opened his arms to lightning. The child shivers. Is her father's life her own? October. More than usual, October is the time of year my mother cries. The days are too orange-red beautiful. They hurt. The way the light gradually softens, the wind won't quit. Brittle maple leaves scrape across the roof, slip to the ground. She sweeps them into piles the wind picks up in quick gusts. She never gives up. She weeps and burns piles of leaves every day. Thick smoke rises through the trees. She wants to protect every blade of summer grass until it turns brown. Then she stands at the back door, looking out across the fading, as if there was something more she could have done. Annie. Annie is my sister. Annie stayed in Indiana and her life was very different than mine. Annie. She trudges Ramada Inn hallways in her brown polyester uniform and thick-soled shoes, shakes blue cleanser on porcelain fixtures and lets it set while she yanks wrinkled sheets from double beds impressed with burdens of strangers. She has 7 hours to scrub 17 rooms to perfection. They don't let her work full time. Caught in a whip of wind, leaves skim the parking lot. She races to her blue Camaro and lights a cigarette, fights the gear shift knob for power and rumbles off toward the daycare center. She stiffens with each of her daughter's raw coughs, fastens plastic around the trailer windows, slices potatoes, pats rounds of hamburger into her mother's iron skillet. Gray clouds pick up speed as the wind blows in from the west. My father and I by fire. Under an expanse of stars, his eyes lock on the dark distance of fir trees or some ancient thought he half remembers but can't place, like remnants of a troubling dream at dawn. I toss a log on the campfire. Little splinters of flame hit the air, light his face. He sits whittling with no sign of conviction at a hunk of wood. Tonight he is calm. What doctors call hallucination is vision to him. Smiles are abhorrent to one whose instincts detect hypocrisy. It was long ago that his terror happened. Then his hands frightened him when cold air plunged down his arms, turned to fire as it rushed out the fingers. He remembers the day he entered the state hospital, how the patients stood in recognition when they saw him there. Nothing more to lose. And the rest of the poems are sort of more toward the end of the book. To myself, the child who hid in closets. I welcome you to sunlight, to walk the path through green trees toward the dark pond, nestled in a tangle of leaves and moss, where you ran until your mother's shrill voice called you back. I forgive you for the times you kept running, splashed through the mucky water, found your favorite poplar, and hoisted yourself up branch by branch until the wind made you pause, forcing her to cut a switch and wait for you on the back porch step. She hated to do it, but you needed to learn. I forgive you for the time you chose a fistful of pills, the best path to peace you could find. What could have been more untenable than hiding in a dark closet, calling forth a ghost to take your hand, or grasping the top branches of a poplar, dreading to come down and face the stinging sassafras, or worse, your father's frantic eyes? And where did you get sleeping pills? I remember looking down at you, barely a teenager, when you awoke, anger flashed in your eyes, your skin pallid, hair damp and matted, knowing they would ask, though you knew no answer to say aloud, why don't you know you are loved? My journey has taken me to countless angels who will not let me die. I want to take you to the path lit by the full moon, mother of mothers, who manages the rhythms of the seas. Find your feet. Let the taproot run down through your souls deep into the ground. Find your hands. Let the pulse give them strength to carry and tenderness to touch. Your heart needs time to know what it feels. Remember yourself with kindness. Feel the peace, the joy that settles beyond the needs of each day. I want to tell you, love is neither want nor need. It is freedom from both. The bliss that awakens enfolds us as we reach inward or out to another. It is a quiet voice that powerfully whispers, live. And this poem is more recent. It was after my father's passing in 2018. I had the privilege to be with him at that time. And we'd worked through a whole lot of things already. It's called Letting Go. He did not allow his children to hug him, so we found other ways to feel his touch. Me, by hurting myself, to be carried to a doctor or bandaged by his hands. He only placed his palms on other heads, bowed in prayer. Though he never said so, we know he loved us. On the final day of his life, I sit by his bedside and read John 3:17, wanting the last words he hears to be that Jesus came to so love, not to condemn. His bird-thin fingers claw at the air. His nearly sightless eyes focus on mine. Am I alive? Yes, Dad, and I'm here. Oh, I thought I was dead. He falls back, mouth open, that labored breathing again. His hand drops to the page. Dad, your palm is resting on Psalms 93. I tell him, though I don't know if he hears me. I read, the Lord is robed in majesty and armed with strength. Do I imagine the smile flickering on his pale, thin lips? He takes no more food, no water. Yesterday, his reed-like fingers, dark-veined, grasped red grapes on his tray, placing them like rare delicacies between pursed lips, rolling them side to side in his mouth, savoring. Now we clasp his hands, pat skin covering bone, tell him through tears, we love you, Dad, it's okay to go. Suddenly, his eyes open, his mouth attempts to form words. We each interpret what he tried to say according to the comfort we need. Did he say, see you later, I love you? Or was he greeting God? I watch his eyes soften to that distance beyond human sight. His hard breath stutters, then stills. His passing does not leave a wound, but a softness, a vast, unyielding silence, a lifting. I see his spirit flutter, a moth with orange and gold wings, like delicate flames at the light, a faint shadow casting off for freedom. I walk away at peace. I have witnessed a remarkable, a terrible beauty, the end of my father's earthly life. And I will just conclude with the poem simply entitled Mother. Under a perfect summer sky, corn shrivels in the fields. Still she fills her shelves with jars of tomatoes, green beans, plenty to share with the neighbors, she says. She opens to me her hands, hardened from heaving buckets of water, shakes her head. The weeds outlive her efforts to defeat them. Showing me how the vine shrinks as the young squash grow larger, leaves brushing her ankles, she leans on her hoe. She is wise as the farmer, feeling the ache of rain seep through the bones before it comes. I rub the bump of skin on my chin, appearing in the same place as hers. Her lines deepen around my mouth. I notice I'm taller than her, just barely, wondering what things she has not yet told me. She gives water to the parched earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rhonda. I really felt the cycle of life in that cycle of your poems, and I think that was a really beautiful place to finish it. So thank you for bringing that to life for us so well with your diction.
Thank you.
Mhm. Our second reader for the day, the event, is Rita Bozi. Raised by Hungarian refugees, Rita is a somatic relational trauma and psychedelic informed therapist, a multidisciplinary creator, playwright, and retired professional actor and dancer. For 25 years, her co-written play, 52 Pickup, was staged in Canada, the US, England, Australia, France, Iceland, and New Zealand, and translated into French and Icelandic. Rita has been published in The New Quarterly, FFWD Weekly, WritingRaw.com, Unlikely 2.0, and Pages of Stories. This magazine awarded her third prize in their Great Canadian Literary Hunt in 2012. Her travel stories have been broadcast on CBC Radio Calgary. She is an alumna of the Humber School for Writers. Rita's debut novel, When I Was Better, which is set in Hungary and Canada, chronicles the 20-year relationship of István and Teresa, from the Nazi invasion, the Soviet occupation, and the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 to their reunion in Winnipeg in 1964. When I Was Better has been long listed for the 2022 Goethe Book Awards for Late Historical Fiction. Bookview Review lauds Rita for skillfully blending plausibility with historical truth and weaving in an engrossing story. Meticulously researched and brilliantly executed, this is a stunner. Feathered Quill says Rita's scene setup and character description is off the charts. There is phenomenal emotion that bleeds across the pages. When I Was Better is more than a good book. It is a memory that steeps into the soul of the reader and one that will linger long after the proverbial the end. Rita, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Hayla, and to Atmosphere Press, to all of you for being here today. My beloved husband, Ken Cameron, without who this book could not have been written. He was an incredible dramaturge and support, so I just want to make sure. And Rhonda, your beautiful and tender poetry, I hold it in my heart as I read, and also very honored to be with Joanne as well. I just would like to precede the reading with to dedicate this reading to refugees everywhere in the world today, particularly in the Ukraine, and also the people of Russia who likely don't want this war. But refugees everywhere in the world today, 1 in 78 people are forced to leave their homes. That's rather daunting. And also the people that are welcoming refugees into their homes.
That's so rude.
I'm going to start with the prologue. This is the cover of the book, and Atmosphere was really great to work with me to get it the way I wanted it. So I just want to acknowledge that. And this prologue takes place in 1964, and it's called This Is What Dying Feels Like. 1964, February 28. Sign language. If Teresa missed a signal or a cue, she would be lost. Her heart raced, and she clutched her passport to her chest. The last person she and her 8-year-old son had spoken with was the unfriendly Malave stewardess from the substandard Hungarian airline. Here in the bustling Brussels airport, Teresa felt like a speechless toddler. Her world had transformed into a place of gestures and facial expressions, making her feel more vigilant now than she had ever been under communism. No one understood her but Zolti. Already she ached for her language and the family she left behind. In her bewilderment, Teresa felt energized and diminished at once. The representatives from Sabina, the Belgian airline, beckoned to them with long, thin arms sheathed in white gloves as she ushered them through the terminal to customs. Lush plants stretched skyward to the sunshine pouring in through the glass ceiling. Pastel colors fused pleasantly with the scent of croissant and café au lait. Everything in the West seemed bright and cheerful. If only Istvan had chosen to settle in Brussels instead of Winnipeg when he fled Hungary without them. But he was always such a contrarian. Teresa kept pace with the woman's long stride and pulled Zolti along as they passed by boutiques where well-to-do women shopped for diamonds and lace, items that were impossibly out of her reach. But here, in the midst of the indecipherable announcements, Teresa could hear only one thing: her last conversation in person, hers and Istvan's. "I'm going today," he said one morning 7 years ago. "How can you do this to us? We could have escaped together as a family. They're coming to arrest me. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" That was the last day she saw him, when his son, Zolti, was but a babe in arms. Istvan woke at dawn with a new set of worries. What if Teresa wasn't on the flight? What if the authorities didn't let her out of Hungary? What if she had decided not to leave? He lay on the sofa bed in his friend's Montreal living room and through the window watched it snow again. He tried for hours to fall back to sleep, but his tossing and turning kept twisting the sheets around his ankles, pulling him down into nightmares. In fits of lucidness, he thought of the day he fled 7.5 years ago, 32 years old. The last time he set eyes on his baby boy lying motionless on the daybed. He'd asked Teresa, "What's wrong with him?" She replied, "What's wrong with you?" He had no answer. Istvan reached over to his neatly folded pile of clothing on the chair, and from his overcoat pocket pulled a tinted photograph taken a half year ago. Mother and son. The last one she'd sent from Hungary. She was almost 34 now, and Istvan was pushing 40. She had such a pretty face, a pretty woman, with a warm smile and skin that always looked clear and bright. When Teresa posed for photos, she had a habit of tilting her head to the right as if trying to improve her appearance, to make life more pleasant somehow. But photos betrayed appearances. This benign bearing couldn't hide the side of her personality that believed existence was beyond repair. She often said, even of good photos, "I hate this picture of myself." Studying the photo, Istvan was fascinated by his son's features. Something troubled him about the boy. He leaned against his mother like an unstable shack, the walls and roof sliding one way, its base clinging to the earth. Years ago, after Istvan reached the refugee camp, Teresa had sent him a picture taken when Zolti was just 14 months old. In it, the toddler's eyes were fixed on something or someone off camera, much taller and bigger than him. He looked worried, startled even, with his button mouth turned downwards. This most recent photograph showed his son's eyes fixed in exactly the same direction with the same startled look. The boy was almost 8, but his expression hadn't changed. Put it all behind you, Istvan. Begin again. Pishta, back from the dead. Istvan laughed aloud. My dear friend, are you speaking to me from heaven? When you died, you stopped being my advisor. Everything comes to an end, Pishta replied. Have you reasonable regret? I do, Istvan replied. Well then? Istvan closed his eyes. The image of wife and son burned itself into the backs of his eyelids. Once he opened them, he would fit back into their lives again. In a cozy corner, a businessman dictated a letter to a typist attired in pale pink pullover and green pumps. Teresa wanted that job in this important glass palace. Mesmerized by the glamour in the terminal, Teresa barely paid attention to her son, who rushed to keep up with his mother. Come, Zolti, we can't fall behind, she said, turning to look at the Chanel perfume counter they passed. It was only then that she realized she had no money in her wallet. Nothing. Even if the Hungarian security officials hadn't relieved her of her forints, they would have been worthless here. But I want to look at the telephones. Zolti locked his knees in the middle of the bustle and refused to move. You'll have one in Canada, please? Teresa's expression was a mixture of pleading and apology. She glanced towards the Sabina representative, who was well ahead of them now. Zolti quickly conceded, sensing his mother's anxiety. The stewardess motioned for them to take a seat. The waiting lounge was full of French businessmen. There were very few families and less than a handful of couples. Teresa was the only single woman with a child. She was troubled to see a very large group of Turkish men in the terminal carrying rucksacks. Rural men who wore old, loose-fitting clothing. The conquerors, she thought, her mind taught to remember the 150-year occupation of her people. A Sabina stewardess politely ushered the group to the waiting area. Wasn't she afraid of them? One of them, likely the same age as Teresa's father, pulled a colorful prayer rug from his bag and with a gracious gesture handed it to the stewardess. She declined until he lightheartedly tucked the rug into the creases of her arms, playfully bending her forearms and hands inwards as if wrapping the rug in a package. Zolti watched them. That's a kind man. Is my father kind too? Yes, he is, Teresa heard herself say through the lump in her throat. She thought of all the times Istvan had forged ahead and created a home for her. Other men thought it the job of the woman to make the nest. It was another way that he was different. A new world was changing her view of the old one for the third time in her life. An announcement crackled over the public address system in French. Some passengers stood. Teresa looked around, worried, understanding only one word. Come, Zolti. We're going to Canada. She felt disembodied, as if part of her was floating in reverse, homeward. 2 hours before the flight's arrival, Istvan paced the spacious corridors of Montreal's Dorval International Airport, retracing his steps when he hit dead ends. He was familiar with the terminal. He'd landed here the day before from Winnipeg. He'd kept alive the hope that there would be one moment in his life when his best intentions and deepest desires aligned. When fear and failure transformed into love and acceptance, and these new states remained effortlessly balanced within him. He yearned for the miraculous transition when fate switched over from loss to triumph, that distant region that held freedom and promised him immunity from pain. Istvan had no proof this place existed, but he had hope. He convinced himself that that day would be today. At arrivals, he watched the automatic doors swoosh open, swoosh closed. Shortly after, a small dog outsmarted its owner, darted straight for Istvan's legs, and ran frantic circles around him, binding him to the leash. The mutt nipped at his ankles, close to losing his balance or swearing at the thing. He hated yappy little dogs. Istvan summoned his composure when he realized, to his amazement, that the dog belonged to a very important-looking woman wearing a snow leopard coat, Elizabeth Taylor. She was waving to a tense-looking man to get that dog. All Istvan could do was marvel at Miss Taylor while the dog choked itself trying to get loose. The man, presumably her assistant, apologized for the mishap and unwound the hysterical animal from Istvan's legs. "It's no trouble," Istvan lied. Surrounded by bodyguards, Miss Taylor offered her lips, and the dog obliged, licking them. She had been married 4 times. One of her marriages caused a scandal when she stole another woman's husband. If she had done this in the East Bloc, no one would have cared. Thievery was to be expected. He wondered if she couldn't be loved enough, if they shared the same affliction. In the blink of an eye, the movie star disappeared through some secret door. Istvan found a news agent and read from the front page captions of English language newspapers. U.S. President announces new jet airplane. He tried to sound out impossible words in the French journals. He imagined how he would greet his wife and son. He didn't know how best to prepare for this. He'd never hugged his boy before. Who should he embrace first? Would his son run at him and jump into his arms? What if his son didn't recognize him? He remembered his wife's fantastic reversals. At first, she offered understanding. Then later, unexpectedly and with unabashed fury, came her real feelings. Anger always came after forgiveness. He wondered how long it would take this time. A little bit more time, or we're at 15 minutes?
We're about at 15, so.
Perfect. We'll stop right there.
Well, you read with such dynamism, Rita. I wish I could hear your voice bring the whole book to life. So I'll have to hope for that in the future. And rounding out our reading today is Joanne Kiser. Joanne is a native of the eastern Kentucky hills, whom chance has allowed a rich and varied life, from her childhood in the hills to being a checker at the New Yorker to completing a dissertation on Proust at the University of Chicago. She has also taught briefly at Morehead State University in Kentucky and at Tennessee Tech. The Guitar Player and Other Songs of Exile is her first full-length work to be published. She reports that her book is showing up in libraries she is happy to be associated with, from the University of Chicago libraries to the Hutchins Library at Berea College in Kentucky. Kirkus Reviews speaks of The Guitar Player and Other Songs of Exile as being fashioned together like a quilt, with patterns that repeat to give the whole a sense of artistic unity. Multiple young women work in publishing and return to the hills of their childhoods, and characters wonder if they can ever escape the class into which they were born. Kiser's descriptions of the fictional communities of Osierville and Sarvis Mountain conjure a tense mixture of beauty and dread. And Jolene Pinanen of Independent Book Review says, all across the board, the writing in this collection is wonderful, crisp, clear, with a weight to it that is hard to shake. The stories feel more like pieces lifted right out of life and slapped fresh upon the page. No sense of beginning or end, just the world turning ever onward. With that, let's hear from Joanne herself.
Well, I think I'm following two very good
readers and two very good writers. So I hope I won't disappoint after all that. And I've chosen to read from a story called The Wedding Ring Quilt. And I've started sort of in the middle of things. It's mainly about two young women from the hills.
Oh, but I can't hear her.
You can't hear me?
Your sound is coming.
Hello.
Your
Ah.
sound is coming through, Joanne. So I think with the volume will be okay.
So anyhow, two young women from the hills, and they are for two different reasons no longer in the hills. And one of them has gotten married to a man from Columbus, Ohio, and it seems to be rather shaky. And Nettie, who's the narrator, has just gone down to Columbus from Detroit to visit Shelley. And Shelley has bought her a red dress. And I'm beginning that fall. I went off to my freshman year at Michigan State. I wore the red dress on the first day of classes. At first, I spent most of my time working on getting high grades and winning the approval of my professors, and I kept to my room on weekends. Little by little, though, two girls on my dorm corridor proved too friendly and forthcoming for my defenses, and there was also a tall, pleasant boy who spoke to me sometimes. My new friends treated college as though it were some necessary disease to which the middle class was prone. Soon I began to cultivate an ironical air, sure all the while that a charmed world, a world I now sought, lay out of sight beyond the curved driveways of the bourgeoisie. There was a bad snow that Christmas, so we did not drive to Kentucky, though Mommy was worried about her own mother. She said she hadn't heard from Mama for several weeks. What about Shelley? I asked, twirling around the room in my red dress. Mommy turned her face away. I guess she's all right, she said. I only half noticed her reservation, having in mind, among other things, Christmas and my brother's forthcoming wedding and my sister's new apartment, my life at college, and the tall, pleasant boy. When spring break came, we did go down to see Mama. I felt that old excitement as we crossed the broad Ohio and caught our first glimpse of the hills. It was lovely weather that day, sunny, both chilled and warm, the sky watercolor blue decorated by wind-tossed clouds. The first green was showing in the woods. The redbud trees were rosy winged. As we rode along the ever-narrowing road deeper into the hills, as we drove finally into Mama's Valley, I saw, as though for the first time, the shacks on the hillsides, the poorly dressed people sitting on their porches. And there at last was Mama's house, the paint peeled now, the porch swing replaced long ago by a rusty edge white and green glider. Sitting in the glider were two women. As we pulled up into the yard, I saw that Shelley was with Mama. Shelley had a huge bruise on the left side of her face. Mama ran into the yard to meet us, but my cousin sat still. What happened to her? What happened to her, Mommy whispered. That no good husband of hers, that's what happened, Mama said. Mommy went on to the porch and hugged Shelley. Like a child who sees a grown-up in trouble, I stood in the yard, dumbfounded and embarrassed. Supported by my mother's arm, Shelley came into the yard and greeted me as though I were a sister. I hear you're doing real well at college, she said. Shelley's been going to school too, Mama said. He didn't want her talking like no hillbilly. I took an evening English class, Shelley said. Well, you're well shut of him, Daddy burst out, and Mommy and Mama nodded their heads, but Shelley said nothing. On Sunday, Shelley and I made our old trip up to the coal bank. Shelley admired my new haircut. Edward bought me this dress, she said shyly. Isn't it pretty? I didn't know what to say. I had been kissed a couple of times by the tall, pleasant boy, and that was the extent of my experience. But even in that, I had felt the deep tide. When we left the next day, Mama and Shelley were standing on the porch. Shelley was dressed in an old cotton dress. She looked again as though she belonged there in Mama's house. Mama had her hand on Shelley's arm. A month later, Mommy told me on the phone that Shelley had gone back to her husband. Summer arrived. I came home and got a job at McDonald's. Daddy and Mommy went to Kentucky for a week and returned shaking their heads. Your mama's getting old, Mommy said to me. She ain't heard nothing from Shelley since she went back. I took a week's vacation in late summer and visited a friend in New York. The bus entered the city at night, the dark new continent with clustering towers of light. My friend and I went to see a play, to the ballet, to a foreign movie. We walked through streets thick with varied people and variegated goods. Surely I had entered this charmed world. Reluctantly, I came home and went back to school. 2 years passed, during which I became more and more involved in the life of my friends. Impatiently, I would go home for short vacations, tearing myself away from the tall, pleasant boy with whom I now indulged in heavy petting. We talked of getting engaged, and he wanted me to go with him to Pittsburgh the next time he visited his parents. I told my parents about the invitation.
Mute, that's what I want.
Anxiously, they asked again what kind of boy he was. How did he behave toward me? Anxiously, my mother told me not to let him go too far. I laughed at their worries, resenting their unhappy insistence, their claim upon my new life. So there was a sad distance in my mother's voice the day she called to tell me that Shelley had killed herself. Shocked out of my self-absorption, I felt our grief and its more general burden. We cried together. We're going down for the funeral tomorrow, she said hesitantly. Oh, I'm coming too, but where's she being buried, Columbus? No, my mother said urgently. She was done separated from that man. She's going home. I did not get to Detroit until 3 a.m, and at 5 we left for Kentucky. As we sped through the lonesome dark, Mommy told me that Shelley had driven out of town, found a river, and jumped in. She had been showing up at Uncle James's apartment frequently in the past year. Well, I just can't take it any longer, she would say to her father. Jimmy would ask her why, Mommy said, and she'd say that man didn't think she was good enough for him. I try to be like he wants, Lord knows I try. The next time she came, she said, that was it. He was seeing another woman, one of his own kind. Give me some money, Daddy, for a bus ticket. I want to go home. But the next day, while your uncle was at work, she drove to the river. It was a home funeral. Shelley's body lay in an open casket in Mama's front room. She was dressed in the long pink dress Mama had made for her graduation, and her hair was pinned on top of her head. Funerals last for days down home. My cousin Leroy, Uncle Clarence's oldest son, was one of the preachers. He said that God had wanted Shelley to stay home with her own kind. I felt a superstitious dread. The uncles carried the casket up the hill to the graveyard where my great-grandmother's stillborn babies lay, and my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather and Papa and Shelley's mother and Uncle Jesse and several more. Plain stone markers stood at the head of the grassy mounds beneath trees that belonged to the old forest. I looked across the valley to another line of hills, smoky in the distance, and then down at the living green, at tree branches afloat in a small wind, and I felt a strange, deep familiarity, an intimate self that would always slumber elsewhere and only awaken in the hills. Afterward, as we sat on Mama's porch watching the lightning bugs, Mama cried out, I want the wedding ring quilt back. My parents and the uncles and aunts nodded their heads. Aunt Delia said, we sure don't want that devil to keep it. Leroy muttered, "They sure ain't gonna send it back." "Then somebody better go get it," Uncle Clarence said. They all nodded their heads again. Mama looked at me. "I reckon Nettie might could get it." They nodded their heads once more. My parents looked anxious. "It might not be safe," my father said. "Oh, Daddy," I admonished him. "What's he going to do to me in broad daylight?" My superior knowledge of the bourgeoisie, gained from those mysterious years at college, won the day. So a few weeks later, I called the number Shelley had given me. I called for several days in a row, but no one answered. "Call his parents," my sympathetic roommate said. I got the number from directory assistants and dialed. Edward's mother answered and said that he was out of town. I told her why I was calling. "I'm sure he doesn't want it," she said frigidly. "Come and get it if you wish." We fixed a time and date, and 2 days later I once again took a Greyhound bus to Columbus. This time there was no one to meet me at the station. I took a city bus. Feeling unexpectedly young and vulnerable, I rang the bell. Edward's father opened the door. His shoulders were stooped, and he seemed a full 2 inches shorter than I remembered. His face was heavy and old and sad as he looked at me. "I remember you," he said. "I've been waiting." He reached out and took my hand and held on to it. "My son didn't treat her right," he said. "That's the sorrow we have to bear." He went inside and returned with the quilt in its heavy plastic bag. Then he insisted on driving me to the hotel where I would spend the night. We rode silently. I got out of the car and could think of nothing more to say than thank you. Carefully, I carried the wedding ring quilt, still in its plastic bag, to my room. I spread the quilt out on the bed and thought that I would return it now to Mama's house. She would put it in the iron-bound trunk, and perhaps someday the wedding ring would go to a bride who would keep it in the hills. I cried for my cousin and for myself, who had begun to realize that there are no charmed worlds except those that we create piece by piece from our histories.
Thank you so much, Joanne. I just, the one moment where you said, the narration said something like "shocked out of my self-absorption," and I feel that shock right along with the narrator at that moment in the story. So I just wanted to say you really evoke the emotions of your characters and your stories and the reader so well. So wonderful to hear that.
Thank you.
Of course. So we have a bit of time here, about 10 minutes for our audience Q&A. So anyone in the audience, including the authors, if you have a question for one or more of the authors tonight, please go ahead and type it in the chat and I will make sure it gets asked. I did want to start off with perhaps a cliche question, but I specifically really want to hear from each of you three. What led you to the titles of these books? They're all three of them, I would say, are rather unique. So I'd really love to hear the tales behind each. Maybe Joanne, if you want to start us off.
All right. Well, I had written that story, The Guitar Player, that leads off the book. So that's where part of it came from. And then I've always felt, in a way, that leaving Kentucky was a form, a mild form, but a form of exile. And so I just put that together.
2 and 2, hand in hand. Rita or Rhonda, do you have any?
Yeah, I'm happy to share. As I was writing this book for 9 years, as my father was dying of dementia, and sometimes he was facing me, asking me what I was writing. And I thought of the many times where neither of us liked attending the Hungarian Roman Catholic Church. And as we gathered outside of the church on Sundays, people would ask my father how he is, and he would always answer in Hungarian, "Amikor jobban voltam, akkor se panaszkodtam," which means when I was better, I didn't brag. And some other Sundays it was, when I was better, I didn't complain. So as I saw my father retreating, facing me, I realized in that moment that he had given me the title of the book, which is When I Was Better.
And same from it came from my father. So many of the poems in the book related to fire. I just started to feel, that fire was such a metaphor in my father's life. It was part of his illness. And one of the poems referred to how he felt fire rushing out his fingertips. A poem I did not read, but he thought of himself as an embodiment of the prophet Elijah, and Elijah prayed and fire came down. So there's a lot of references to that in other poems. So for me, it's just that fire image kept coming back. And then one of the poems that I did read today was called My Father and I by Fire. And so I just kind of, when I got to that poem and started looking at all the books, all the poems in the books, I thought, that's the title. That's it. That just came out to me as the title.
All three of them are really cases of just the title coming about organically as a result of the stories. And perhaps that makes for the best titles. I certainly think so for all my favorite books. But we do have a question in the chat. This one is from Catherine to all three of you. First, thank you to each of the authors for sharing their lovely works. I'd like to ask each one of you how long you worked on your books.
Well, I could answer that. Giving a lot of time off, I would say about 50 years.
A life work, perhaps.
I think the same for me. I don't have quite 50, but I know I spent 35 years easily on it. I started working on it in the 80s. And yeah, it's been a lifelong journey for me too.
In terms of intergenerational trauma, I've been writing it since the womb, but practically I spent 9 years writing it, and then 2 years of 75 rejections and rewrites and massive rewrites. And so probably about 11, 12 years, and plus also the 57 since the womb.
All of them, yeah, just this amalgamation over a long period, it seems like, which really gives the stories time to develop, I would say. This question comes in from Susan to Rhonda. How did your father's illness play into his ministry?
As I was mentioning, if you read the book and you read a lot of the other poems, hopefully they all fall together. There's various pieces of his story. My father was a Pentecostal preacher, and he thought in his illness that he became the prophet Elijah. And so there were many times when that would present itself in the evenings, and that's what those poems about. My first memories of him knowing something was happening was waking up and hearing him sing about being the prophet Elijah, and how my mother wanted us to not talk about that. And so I would say all of his hallucinations really went always back to the religious background that he had, and how he thought in his life he wasn't doing quite the best he could do, and so he felt a lot of guilt. And so if he was going to be a prophet Elijah, he had to be pretty much perfect, he thought, and he couldn't be that. And so that also played into his illness. I don't know if that answers it, but that's part of it anyway.
Definitely. A question from Ken to Rita. When I Was Better is written out of order. How did you go about doing that?
Well, first of all, I was very inspired by the film Memento And I'd also co-written a play many years ago called 52 Pickup, 52 scenes of a play that I performed every night out of order, and it depends on how we picked up the cards. So we had to be right on it to dive in the middle of a scene that was completely out of order. And I always think about the fact that we don't remember things chronologically. Our memories are fragmented. So I didn't want to write 20 years of this huge epic in chronological order. I kind of wanted the readers to work for it a little bit, and I wanted to work for it a little bit and realize that it takes a while to piece our lives together, and that's what trauma is like. So with the help of my husband, who helped me pull it apart and work on some continuity, because we had to go through the whole thing and figure out who's been introduced, who hasn't been introduced. It was a massive, massive puzzle, mind puzzle. But I always love it when things, when you leave clues somewhere and you have to pick them up later. So it was at the Banff Center at the Leighton Arts Colony. It was a massive amount of paper spread across the floor, trying to put together in a way that was rather intuitive. I'm going to say it was rather intuitive.
Yeah, I feel like that hearing you talk about the role of memory and how it functions, that totally makes sense with a story like this. So fascinating to hear that too, especially with your background. So we have a question from Barbara to Joanne. Joanne, do you live back in the South now? And if so, how is it to return? Are you
I just
accepting?
answered it in the chat room.
I missed
but I
it.
will repeat. No, I don't live in the South now. I live in Ohio. And I've lived other places. And I think my cousins accept me as a native, but I'm not sure whether a lot of other people would or not.
Yeah, I guess it's a sort of an individual thing for each person, but we'll close out with one final question that is for each of you. I'm really interested in this one. This one's from Susan to all of you. How do your egos handle the process? Perhaps interpret that as you will.
And I answered, the writing okay, the publishing rather scary.
Any
I
thoughts?
think that,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Rita.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it was okay. I thought it was Rita.
I might reframe that and say, how does my trauma handle the process? It's a lot of support, a lot of work with plant medicine, Dr. Gabor Mate, a lot of self-inquiry, a lot of collapse, a lot of pain, more pain, thinking the book was going to kill me before I died, and gathering friends and family together to support the process and people that I trust. But my ego can handle it, my trauma can't. How's that?
Probably true for all of us, huh? But for me, it was a journey of healing. And for me, telling the story, I mean, I think very often the stories that are told are we tell them to heal ourselves or to heal each other. And for me, it began of just trying to understand and work together what was traumatic for me as a child. And then I began to have conversations with my dad about those times, and he started to slowly open up and tell me stories. So many of the poems have his stories in them, and so that I could understand better where he was coming from, and I could understand sort of the whole family dynamic. I understood my mother better after I understood our whole story better. So for me, it was, I don't know if we ever get our egos totally out of it because we're telling our stories, but for me, it was about healing. And I think that when I came to the conclusion finally of the book, I felt healed.
You just continue to be so great at this full circle sort of answers or reading, Rhonda. I love that. But with that, that will conclude our Q&A. And I just want to say again, it's so great to hear all of your stories and your words in the voices of their writers. So thank you so much to Rhonda, Rita, and Joanne for your generosity today with your time, your words, your thoughts. And of course, thank you to everyone in the audience for being here to celebrate these fantastic writers. Don't forget to order By Fire, When I Was Better, and The Guitar Player and Other Songs of Exile from the links in the chat, which I just dropped there. And then please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com to browse our new and forthcoming releases, to sign up for our email newsletter, or to submit a book manuscript of your own. You can always feel free to submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and let us know that you attended today's event. We'll look forward to hearing from you, but for now, that's it. Have a peaceful rest of your weekend, everyone.